The morning fog lifted from Chicago's near north side like a theater curtain, revealing a stage set for an impossible performance. Margaret Shin stood at the corner of LaSalle and Division, her leather portfolio clutched against her chest, staring at something that violated every principle of architecture, construction. In reality, she had studied during her decade as a city planning inspector, where yesterday had stood an empty lot, a carefully documented vacant parcel that she had personally surveyed and photographed for the municipal records just 48 hours earlier. Now rose a 12-story Art Deco masterpiece that appeared to have been standing there for half a century. Dr. Edmund Walsh emerged from the warmth of his black sedan, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses against the October chill of 1962. At 63, the professor of urban planning at Northwestern University had seen Chicago transform from a collection of scattered settlements into one of America's great metropolitan centers. But the structure before him challenged every assumption he had formed about the ordered progression of urban development. The building's limestone facade bore the weathered patina of decades. Its brass fixtures showed the appropriate oxidation of age, and the mature elm trees flanking its entrance had root systems that would have required at least 30 years to establish. "Margaret, doctor," Walsh said quietly, his breath forming small clouds in the morning air. "I need you to confirm what you documented during your survey. This lot was definitely vacant when you conducted your inspection." Margaret opened her portfolio with trembling fingers, extracting a manila folder thick with photographs, surveys, and official documentation. "Empty lot, parcel number 17-09-401-024, surveyed October 14th and 15th. Concrete foundation remnant from the previous structure demolished in 1958. Soil contamination testing completed. Zoning variance application pending for mixed-use development." Her voice carried the precision of someone trained to trust only in measurable facts. But those facts now seemed to mock her with their inadequacy. She spread the photographs across the hood of Dr. Valtsiedon. Black and white images showed an undeniably vacant lot. Broken concrete, scattered debris, the characteristic urban emptiness of a parcel waiting for redevelopment. In the background of every photograph, the neighboring buildings were clearly visible, the same buildings that now stood adjacent to the impossible Art Deco tower, but showing no indication that such a structure had ever existed beside them. Dr. Walsh examined each photograph with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to analyzing urban development patterns. The neighboring structures show no architectural accommodation for this building. No party walls, no shared foundations, no evidence of construction planning that would account for a structure of this magnitude. Yet now, they both turned to study the building again. It rose with perfect integration into the urban landscape, its design harmonizing flawlessly with the surrounding architecture of the 1920s and 1930s. The brass nameplate beside the entrance read Meridian Trust Building, established 1928, and through the lobby windows, they could observe people moving about their daily business with the casual familiarity of long-term occupancy. "The municipal records," Margaret said, consulting another folder. "I've reviewed every document in the city planning office. Building permits, construction approvals, occupancy certificates, tax assessments, utility connections. There is no record of this building ever being planned, approved, constructed, or occupied. According to every official document, this parcel has been vacant since 1958. Doctor." Walsh approached the building's entrance with scientific curiosity overriding his instinctive caution. The brass doors bore the elaborate engraving typical of 1920s commercial architecture, but the details were worn in patterns that suggested decades of human contact. Door handles showed the characteristic polishing of thousands of hands, and a marble threshold bore the subtle depressions created by countless footsteps over many years. A uniformed doorman emerged from the lobby, his appearance and manner suggesting he had been performing this role for many years. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "Are you here for an appointment? I'll need to announce you to reception." Margaret and Dr. Walsh exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of this interaction. They were not dealing with a recently constructed building staffed by new employees, but with an establishment that operated with a settled routine of decades. "We're from a city planning office," Margaret replied carefully. "We're conducting a routine survey of commercial properties in this district. Could you tell us how long the Meridian Trust Building has been operating at this location?" The doorman smiled with the patient warmth of someone who had answered similar questions many times before. "The Meridian Trust has been serving Chicago businesses since 1928. We're quite proud of our history. Would you like to speak with someone from our Historical Archives department?" Ms. Patterson on the 8th floor maintains extensive records of the building's development and the companies that have been based here over the years. They entered the lobby, and both immediately noticed details that reinforced the building's apparent authenticity. The marble floors showed were patterns consistent with decades of foot traffic. The elevator indicators bore the Art Deco styling of the late 1920s, but showed the mechanical wear of 34 years of continuous operation. Most significantly, the building's interior temperature and humidity levels suggested the seasoned equilibrium that only develops in structures that have weathered many seasonal cycles. Ms. Eleanor Patterson greeted them in an office furnished with filing cabinets that contained what appeared to be decades of meticulously maintained records. She was a woman in her late 50s, with the bearing of someone who had devoted her career to institutional memory and organizational continuity. "The Meridian Trust Building," she explained, gesturing toward a wall lined with photographs showing the building at various stages throughout its apparent history, was designed by the architectural firm of Morrison and Associates and completed in September 1928. The construction was financed by a consortium of Chicago business leaders who wanted to create a commercial center that would serve the growing financial district north of the river. Margaret examined the photographs with growing bewilderment. They showed the building under construction, depicting the gradual rise of the structure from foundation to completion. Workers in period clothing operated machinery typical of 1920s construction projects. The surrounding neighborhood was documented at each stage, showing how the area had developed around the building throughout the 1930s and 1940s. These photographs, Margaret said carefully, they document the building's construction and the development of the surrounding area over many years. But according to city records, this parcel has been vacant since 1958. Ms. Patterson consulted her own files with obvious confusion. "I'm afraid there must be some error in the city records. The Meridian Trust has maintained continuous operations for 34 years. We have tenant records dating back to our opening, tax payment receipts, utility bills, and maintenance contracts that document our ongoing presence at this location." Dr. Walsh requested permission to examine the building's structural elements, and Ms. Patterson gladly provided access to the basement mechanical rooms and the upper floors. What they discovered deepened the mystery beyond any rational explanation. The building's infrastructure showed the accumulated modifications and updates that would be expected in a structure operating for over 3 decades. Electrical systems bore evidence of multiple upgrades, Plumbing fixtures showed appropriate aging and replacement cycles. And the heating system contained boilers that had clearly been in service for many years. More puzzling still, the building contained archived records that documented its interaction with city departments over decades. Construction permits for renovations conducted in 1935, 1947, and 1956. Correspondence with planning officials regarding zoning adjustments and occupancy modifications. Tax assessment records showing gradual increases in property value corresponding to neighborhood development throughout the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. Margaret Dr. Walsh said as they reviewed the documentation in Ms. Patterson's office, "We are confronting evidence that suggests this building has existed continuously since 1928, despite the fact that municipal records show no trace of its existence. And despite your personal documentation that this parcel was vacant as recently as 2 days ago." Margaret had been conducting her own systematic examination of the evidence, applying the methodical analysis that her training had taught her to use when evaluating complex urban development issues. "The physical evidence is internally consistent," she concluded. "Everything about this building suggests genuine age and continuous occupancy. The wear patterns, the accumulated modifications, the integration with surrounding infrastructure, the establishment of mature landscaping, all of it supports the conclusion that this structure has been operating for decades." They spent the remainder of the day conducting interviews with building tenants and neighboring business owners. Each person they spoke with confirmed the Meridian Trust Building's long-standing presence in the neighborhood. The owner of the delicatessen across the street mentioned that he had been selling lunch to Meridian Trust employees since he opened his shop in 1943. The manager of the parking garage next door described routine interactions with building management that dated back to the early 1950s. Every conversation reinforced the building's apparent history, while simultaneously contradicting the documented evidence that the parcel had been vacant. The breakthrough came when Dr. Walsh discovered a reference in the Northwestern University Library archives to a research project conducted in 1959 by one of his predecessor professors. The project had involved documenting temporal displacement events in urban environments, instances where structures or locations appear to exist in multiple states simultaneously, creating contradictory evidence about their history and development. The archived research described several documented cases in Chicago where buildings, streetscapes, or entire city blocks had exhibited characteristics that suggested they existed according to different timelines. The Meridian Trust Building, according to the research notes, had been identified as a structure of particular interest due to reports from city planning officials that it appeared and disappeared from official records without any corresponding changes to its physical presence. Margaret Dr. Walsh said as they reviewed the archived research late that evening in the university library, "It appears we have encountered something that has been documented before, but never adequately explained. The evidence suggests that certain locations in the city exist according to multiple timelines simultaneously, creating situations where structures can be simultaneously present and absent, depending on which temporal perspective is being applied." Margaret struggled to reconcile this explanation with her systematic understanding of urban planning principles. "Are you suggesting that the Meridian Trust Building exists in some kind of parallel timeline, and that we somehow gained access to that timeline while the city records remained locked in a different temporal state?" Dr. Walsh nodded grimly. The archived research suggests that temporal displacement events occur most frequently in areas where significant construction or demolition has created discontinuities in the urban fabric. When a previous structure was demolished in 1958, it may have created conditions that allowed the Meridian Trust Building to manifest from an alternate timeline, where it was constructed in 1928 and has been operating continuously. They returned to the building the following morning, but found that accessing it had become significantly more difficult. The structure remained physically present, but interactions with its staff and tenants have become inconsistent and dreamlike. Some visitors could enter and conduct normal business, while others found themselves unable to locate the entrance or discovered that their attempts to enter the building somehow led them to different locations entirely. Margaret documented these changes with growing fascination and alarm. The building appears to be becoming unstable, existing partially in our timeline and partially in its original temporal state. People who attempt to interact with it are sometimes successful and sometimes experience displacement to locations that correspond to where they would be if the building didn't exist. Dr. Walsh's academic analysis provided a framework for understanding their situation, but offered little comfort. We may have witnessed a temporary stabilization of the building in our timeline, but the normal forces of temporal consistency appear to be reasserting themselves. The Meridian Trust Building is returning to its original temporal state, and our memory of its presence will likely be the only evidence that this event occurred. The final phase of the building's temporal displacement occurred over the course of a week in early November. Visitors reported that their experiences inside the building began to feel increasingly distant and dreamlike. Business transactions conducted on Monday would be forgotten by Wednesday. People who worked in the building would arrive at their offices to find empty desks in locations that didn't correspond to any known structure. Margaret made daily visits to document the transition, watching as the building gradually faded from consensus reality. The physical structure remained visible, but became increasingly difficult to enter, but if it existed behind an invisible barrier that grew stronger each day. By November 12th, only she and Dr. Walsh could perceive the building clearly, and their attempts to bring other people to witness it resulted in confusion and disorientation for anyone they tried to convince. On November 15th, 1962, Margaret conducted her final survey of parcel number 17-09-401-024. Her photographs showed an empty lot identical to the images she had captured in October, before the Meridian Trust Building had materialized. The concrete foundation remnants from the structure demolished in 1958 were once again visible, and the urban landscape had returned to the configuration documented in all official city records. But Margaret retained detailed documentation of the building's 3-week presence in their timeline, including photographs, architectural measurements, and interviews with staff and tenants. Dr. Walsh preserved his analysis of the temporal displacement phenomenon, adding the Meridian Trust case to the small but growing collection of similar events documented by researchers at Northwestern University. The building that wasn't there yesterday had returned to whatever temporal state it normally occupied, leaving behind only questions about the nature of urban reality and the possibility that cities exist in multiple states simultaneously. Margaret continued her career as a city planning inspector, but with an enhanced awareness that the municipal records she maintained might represent only one version of Chicago's true urban landscape. And on certain mornings, When the fog lifts from the near north side and the light hits the cityscape at precisely the right angle, careful observers report glimpses of buildings that don't appear on any official map, structures that exist according to their own temporal logic, waiting for the right conditions to manifest once again in the consensus reality of the modern city.